This is the part in the lectionary cycle when we come to realize how much shorter Mark's gospel is in comparison to Matthew and Luke, because to kind of fill in the gaps that Matthew and Luke would have easily gone through, we have a few weeks that the church has decided to balance out with John's gospel. And I think it's an important section of John's gospel that I think is for us to reflect upon these next few weeks. It's from the 6th chapter of John's gospel. Now this is the bread of life discourse, the chapter on the Eucharist. And so John 6 begins with the multiplications of the loaves and fish. And you might be asking, well, we're going to be thinking about that, we're listening to that passage again? Yes, again. It's the one gospel miracle, it's the only gospel miracle that's found in all 4 gospels. And it's actually found twice in the gospels of Mark and Matthew. And so we come upon it frequently in the lectionary cycle. And so this Sunday's reference to the loaves and fish is an introduction to the Gospel's teaching on the bread of life discourse. And everything in this account has particular meaning. Jesus goes up a mountain to teach, just as instructions from Moses and Elijah came from a mountain. The feast of Passover is near. Jesus provides physical food here, but on another feast of Passover, he will provide the bread of life. Jesus has the people recline on the grass like the sheep led to verdant pastures in Psalm 23. I think I remember Father Bill years ago you might have said something to the effect of, now the grass was there to make them a little bit more receptive to the food that they would then soon get. The wacky grass. It's like, it's not that kind of grass, Father Bill. No. In fact, I remember when I was in Israel at the site where this more than likely would have taken place. It's this beautiful green pasture, and there's enough of a slant. It's not like a steep. When you think of like you're up on a mountain, it's like could be like have these steep slopes, but no, it's very gradual downward slope, and you could see where thousands of people could gather together, and Jesus perched on the top of it and speak out over, and his voice descending down upon this crowd. There is a spot it does make sense that this scene would take place in. And then we see after the people eat, Jesus has his disciples gather up the remnants of the bread, and they fill up 12 wicker baskets, 12 tribes of Israel. There would be 12 apostles of the new Israel. And I want to focus in on the gathering of the fragments. Now, unlike the manna that the Hebrews ate wandering through the desert, the fragments were not to be thrown away. They came from God. And think about that. This happens in our churches every time we celebrate Mass. The fragments are not thrown away. All right? Bread and wine are consecrated, not blessed, but consecrated. They become the Eucharist, the body and blood of the Lord. And once the physical elements are transformed, they remain the body and blood of the Lord. Not because we say it so, right? It's independent of us and our desires for it, right? And so we place the consecrated hosts in our tabernacles because this is still the Lord. And this is you could see this historically from the earliest days, right? There was always something in the minds of the early church, like, that the remnants are to be preserved, to be remained, but then to be taken to those who, for what no fault of their own, could not make it to join us around this altar at this Mass, right? To the sick, right? We still do that to this day. And then when the church got to a point where it was not on the run, it wasn't persecuted, where they could actually build structures and have places that they could call houses of worship they could call home. It wasn't in the catacombs, it wasn't on the move. You see the building structures that would hold, like tabernacles, sometimes small little boxes that would hover over the altar, and then eventually, like tabernacles that we see. We see this from the earliest days. And so the Eucharist is not merely a liturgical action during Mass. It is Jesus. And he is really present in the consecrated species, the bread and the wine. It's my experience of the Eucharist, but my kind of deepening understanding of its reality. It's always kept me home. It's always kept me Catholic. There are periods in life where, sometimes it happens, where you have temptations to wander. Maybe, that this church down the street, they seem to be a lot. They seem a little more entertaining. This over there. You have these temptations. But the Eucharist has always been the piece that has always kept me here. It's like, well, they don't teach the Eucharist there. It's not the same thing. Because there are times that people will leave the church, Catholic Church, for other non-Catholic Christian churches. And if I'm approached about this, I will tell them that they may have their reasons for leaving the church, but they're leaving the Eucharist, right? At least as we understand the Eucharist as the real presence of the Lord. And many times these people will say, well, no, they have communion services in this or that denomination, but, well, yes, but that's not the real presence of the body of Christ. These denominations celebrate a symbolic action of unity with each other and with the Lord, but they do not believe that the bread and wine themselves become the body and blood of the Lord. That's why they don't have tabernacles, right? There's no reason for them to save that which they only recognize as bread after the service. I remember one woman coming to me after a while feeling a little scandalized, like not realizing that there was, I realized that was the case. I think she had gone to she had been invited by a family member. It might have been a Baptist church, an Episcopal, something of that nature, and they happened to be at that time where they were having communion, and she had to go into their sacristy afterward to speak to someone there, and while she was going to into their sacristy, one of the attendants was dumping out the remnants that they had used for communion, and she's like, "Oh, they really don't believe in the Eucharist as we understand it. That's why I can't participate in their communion. They don't believe in the real presence of the Lord in the Eucharist as we understand it." Got it. It's like growing up in northern Maine that I did. We didn't have access to a lot of Italian food. And I probably only ate Italian food for the first time. I was probably in my late teens. Now, my mother did serve Italian food for us growing up. Spaghetti with tomato juice and Hamburg. I thought that was spaghetti and meatballs. But any real Italian would look at me and say, "Oh, you ain't had the real stuff." And they're right. And I could go back in my life, I could convince myself to think, yes, I did have real Italian food when I was a kid, that what my mother served was real Italian food. It's like, no. It looked like it, had a facsimile of it, but it wasn't it in reality, right? When I experienced the real thing, I'm like, now I get it. Now I get it, right? And when we, and the same thing too. If anyone who's kind of come into who's coming from other faiths and come into the church will attest to this. There's something deeper, more profound, and so we respect our non-Catholic Christian brethren. We respect them, but we also recognize that what we believe is different than what they believe. We believe this is truly, really the body and blood of Christ, truly present. And so to leave the Catholic Church for another faith is to reject the gift of the real presence of Jesus Christ as Eucharist. And once a person is brought into the mystery of the Eucharist, that person cannot leave this mystery. It would be a rejection of a great grace given when that person became Catholic or entered that stage of life when he or she could come to an understanding of what we Catholic believe about the Eucharist. Right? And just think about how great our God is. God is so great that he has found a way for all of us to attend the eternal Passover. When we come at Mass, heaven does not come down to us. We are lifted up into heaven. We are surrounded by the angels and saints in heaven and the eternal Passover meal. God is so great that he leads us into his presence and feeds us his meal. God is so great that he has found a way for each of us to join the disciples at the Last Supper, or what is really the First Supper of the kingdom. God is so great that he has created billions and billions of people in the world, and yet he has found a way to treat each person as though they were the only ones he ever created. And so when we receive communion, we are present at the Last Supper, at First Supper, the banquet of the Lord. When we receive communion, we enter into the intimate union with God that Jesus came to earth to provide. How much our God cares for us. He has found a way to nourish our spiritual lives. His very body and blood keeps us strong. He gives us the strength to proclaim his kingdom. You know, I remember a man years ago who I used to see him come to church with his wife. He wasn't Catholic, he was Baptist, but he would come faithfully with his wife, and I would have conversations with him about, like, you know, had he ever thought about making the transition, you know, swimming the Tiber, as they say. And we'd have these back and forth. He's like, hey, just the fact that I'm in this church is making my mother roll over in her grave. Little baby steps. But what always caught me, what caused me pause, was one thing he told me. It's like one of his biggest hurdles that he's trying to overcome is, like, if that truly is the real presence of the Lord in the Eucharist, why does the church empty so quickly? And that for him was a huge stumbling block. And so we need to ask ourselves at communion time, what am I doing? What am I doing? Am I just following the crowd? Am I just entering another line and just saying, okay, what's going on? Hopefully not. Am I receiving some sort of blessing? Hopefully we realize that communion is much more than a blessing. What is it that I'm doing when I receive communion, and what am I doing afterward? I am receiving the food that God provides. I'm being nourished with the body and blood of Christ. I'm truly becoming in communion with the one who made heaven and earth. And am I allowing his real presence to affect me? Am I allowing myself to rest with him, to sit with him, to be acknowledged in a sufficient way? And so today we pray for a deeper appreciation and a deeper reverence for the great gift of love that is the Eucharist.